Hello and welcome to this tutorial. I'm Stefan Hampel, I'm a generalist at Industrial Light & Magic, and today I will show you how I created my entry for the Infinite Journeys challenge. So let's start with the first point, which is references. So obviously I'm heavily inspired by my favorite theme, which is cyberpunk, Blade Runner-ish cities, like this cold, uninviting, Sovietish architecture styles, surrounded by fog and lights, and especially this screenshot from the anime from Ghost in the Shell was my main inspiration for lighting and grading later on. I will show you some scenes of my raw renders later, and you will see that they're actually not that greenish, and that all happened in grading at the very last step. The second point is the layout, which always starts with the camera. Luckily, I had to not worry about the camera since it already existed, and the basic composition too. So there's like simple window in the foreground and whatever we want in the background. So one of my main ideas was to have a big cliff between the city blocks, leading to the main asset of the scene, which is basically the center of the whole city. Obviously, I didn't model the whole thing on my own. I always start with some kind of kit bashing, and this time I'm using the kit bash 3D Soviet blocks kit, which is pretty detailed, and you might recognize it right away. I only use these kind of kits as a base though. I never work with their textures and their shaders, I build them on my own. Then I just start blocking out the real city blocks and instance them, rotate them around, so you don't see the repetition. In scene context, you can actually see how much I reused the same assets all over again and just enhanced the details on the lower pulley regions with just more smaller details. And overall it looks super empty, but when you look through the camera it actually looks super crowded and super dense, and that's what it's all about. Placing the assets for your camera. Talking about details, for this shot I actually wanted some moving cables in the foreground, so I decided to create some curves on Max, export them to Maya so I could use the NHAIR simulation tool to sim the cables properly, convert them to a mesh and then re-export them as an alembic into my Max scene and shade them in Max. Another small detail is also the animated people on the rooftops, which I got from Mixamo and just scattered around the rooftops. You might not really see them, but here it's all about the small details which sell the realism. One more thing is the actual three-dimensional smoke, or let's call them VDBs, which I created in Houdini. And I'm not a really Houdini expert, and luckily I have a good friend who showed me how to do these kind of sims in Houdini, so I made them here. I did a couple variations and then just scattered them in the foreground using the Vray volume grid. Probably my favorite thing in CG is the shading and the lighting of the scene. I really like to create procedural materials which then I can just apply to any kind of asset and it never looks the same. But let's talk about lighting first, because it's not that complicated in my scene. I know my main light source is gonna be like the neon lights and the street lights. First of all, I have three light groups. One is my dome light, which is just a fill light, so nothing is really pure black. Then I have my foreground lights, which just boost the reflections in my foreground, so it's also not just pure black. And then there's my main light source, which is the street lights on the ground. And just like in my reference, the lights are pretty bright and are shining directly at the walls of the buildings. Now let's talk about materials and shading. So luckily, the kitbash 3D stuff comes already with a pre-constructed network, which I use as a base, so I don't have to work on VIDs or anything. I just use the shader and then plug in my own textures on stuff. And I really like to work with composite nodes to break up textures, and especially I like to work with the Vray UV randomizer, which is explained in this video by Chaos Group. And it's pretty useful, and I use it very often just to break up huge scale textures. Fun fact, I actually also used the concrete material from Punisher. I mean his endless concrete material, because it's super easy to cover huge scale of walls. Another awesome thing is rich dirt. If you don't know what it is, it basically creates masks based on occlusion, and it's super easy to make like streaks and add dirt to your walls and all your materials. Enough talking, let me show you a quick example in this time lapse. I always do the compositing part in Nuke. I use Nuke mainly for land simulation or like adding smoke, and my Nuke crashed. Anyways, I'm usually rebuilding the beauty pairs, and here I'm actually using a noise expression to get some variation in the lighting on the window. So it should look like it's like actually passing light sources, you know, so it's flickering a bit, and here you can see that it's actually looking pretty natural. Sometimes I'm using 2D elements like smoke in the background just because it doesn't make sense to render it in 3D, so I'm just enhancing the render with elements like this by simply projecting them onto cards and place them in a 3D space. I'm using the Z depth channel as a mask, so it's actually behind stuff. So here I wanted to place it behind this antenna or whatever. Same thing goes for the smoke behind the buildings, just to silhouette them better, so I added these same techniques over and over again. Then there's also small details like animated flares. It's really subtle, but in my opinion it's a nice addition to the image. So this is how the final comp looks like. It looks pretty good, but it still lacks something, so I decided to hop into After Effects and do some grading on Magic Bullet Looks. And after adding some grain, this is the final render.